Hi there, I'm Todd Leet, and welcome to U.S. History with Leet. Today we're going to talk about the American Revolution Part 2, Declaring Independence, but first, let's find these notes. So go ahead and fire up your web browser and point it to www.toddleet.com. It's your home on the internet for everything Todd Leet related. So you go to my website, toddleet.com, and click on U.S. History, because that is the class that we are talking about right now, and scroll down to Unit 5, the American Revolution, PowerPoint Part 2. That's the set of notes we're going to be looking at. Click on that. It'll open up a PowerPoint in a new window, and you can follow along with what we're doing, or you can click back on the Word document and get the paper copy of the notes. For my lesson, the American Revolution Part 2, Declaring Independence, let's get it started. All right, welcome to the American Revolution Part 2, Declaring Independence. So in Part 1, we had talked about a lot of the works of the Second Continental Congress, both what they're doing to manage some stuff on the battlefield, and we'll come back to battlefield stuff later, but also the work that they're doing to try to decide whether or not the relationship with Great Britain can be repaired and we can go back to being on good terms with the king, or whether or not that the relationship is irreparable and we're on the road to independence. So, a lot of people are not yet ready for independence, especially in the middle and the southern colonies. But as events take place out on battlefields and we don't hear back from the king, it becomes very, very clear that we're heading toward independence. And what we're going to talk about is how do we get people all the way there? Because you can't declare independence from a nation like Great Britain with only some people involved. This really is something where everyone's got to be on board. And the Second Continental Congress was split originally as to whether or not the time was right to declare independence. We talked about people like John Adams up in Massachusetts, who's ready for independence, but there's a lot of moderates for the middle and southern colonies who are not yet ready for independence. And one of those moderates we talked about was a Pennsylvanian by the name of John Dickinson. So Dickinson decides that we need to have one last ditch Hail Mary effort to get a hold of the king and get him back, and that is with his Olive Branch Petition. So the Olive Branch Petition, again, I'm paraphrasing, basically, is a letter to the king that goes something like this. Dear King, listen, you've probably heard a lot about us and probably think that we want independence, but that's not true. The colonies enjoy being part of the empire, and really all we want is fair trade status, representation in parliament, and taxes equal to those that people in Great Britain pay. And even though our relationship is soured right now, and not really on great footing, if we could just get those things, we'd come back to you in a heartbeat, and we could put all this behind us. We still love you. Signed, the colonies. Essentially, that's what it says. Now, lots of guys like John Adams knew that this was nonsense and this wasn't going to work and the king wasn't going to answer, because sure enough, the king didn't answer. And that's because the same day he finds out about the Battle of Breed's Hill, where he loses 1,000 soldiers, he also gets this letter from us, the colonies, and he wants no part of it. He's furious about how the war is going, the fact that he's lost 1,000 men to us, and he's not gonna hear anything about trade status or membership in parliament. I mean, this is a rebellion as far as he's concerned, and you don't negotiate with people like us. So the king's not gonna read our letter, and he's not gonna answer it. So people in the Second Continental Congress are starting to get the idea that we're pretty much on the road to revolution here. So that's people in the government. But what about the average Joe? Well, the thing that probably influenced the average colonist more than anything else was actually a book, not a speech, not experiences on the battlefield, but a book, a small book, a pamphlet. Even I go so far as to say a pamphlet by a British man named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was from England, and he settled in Pennsylvania, and so he had a colonial life. And he was here throughout, the 1760s and 70s, and he really got a feel for what it means to be a colonist. And he started to realize that it only makes sense, it's common sense, that the colony should break free from England, that the time had come, that it is just natural, this is the course of nature, that we should become our own nation. And so he puts it in pretty plain English. In fact, it's still readable even through to today. If you end up going to college and studying history or political science, you may end up even reading it. It's not very hard to read. I got a little section here from Common Sense, and people read it and they think to themselves, "Yeah, this makes a lot of sense." Here's what he says: No man was a warmer wisher for reconciliation than myself before the fatal 19th of April, 1775. But the moment the event of that day was made known, I rejected the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England forever, and disdained the wretch that with the pretended title of father of his people can unfeelingly hear of their slaughter and composedly sleep with their blood upon his soul. It's pretty good writing, and it's not very hard to read, even in 2018. So basically, what he's saying is, listen, before Lexington and Concord, because that's what happens on April 19th, 1775. Before Lexington and Concord, just as much as anybody, I wanted us to get back with England and fix the relationship. But when I heard about how that day went down, how the king's own men fired upon his subjects, even though he pretends to be the father of his people, how can a father sleep at night knowing he's killed his children? I can't stand for that, basically. And that's what Common Sense is all about. And it goes on to say that it's the natural order of things, that we should be our own nation. And so people read this book and they pass this book on to other people. So again, it's not a hard read. It's a pretty small book. You read it and then you share it with people. And that's how the ideas of common sense really spread throughout the colonies, is people read the book and then they hand it to somebody else and they hand it to somebody else. And before you know it, people up and down, the East Coast, the 13 colonies, are all reading, this small book by, by this Englishman who's become a colonist. And it makes a pretty good argument as to whether or not, as to why we should be our own thing. And so Common Sense is probably, just as responsible as anything else for getting the average person ready and willing to fight for independence more than anything else. So by the middle of 1776, it's pretty clear that there's not going to be any reconciliation with Great Britain. The king doesn't answer any of our letters. He's only sending more soldiers. There's been more casualties on the battlefield. It's obvious that there's no repairing this relationship. Everybody who's a member of the Second Continental Congress has been declared an outlaw by the king. So there's no going back. We're through the looking glass here. It's time to declare independence. So on June 7th, a Virginia delegate stands and makes a motion in front of the Second Continental Congress. And that motion is that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states. So he's motioning that we vote to become an independent country. But they don't take a vote immediately. He makes the motion, it's seconded, but they don't vote immediately like they normally would, but instead they table it. That means they take a timeout. And they say, if we're going to vote on this, we probably should explain to everyone why we're doing it. We need like an explanation, or perhaps a declaration of our independence, an explanation as to why we're doing this. So let's do this. Let's take a timeout and let's get a couple guys together and have them draft this letter to the world explaining why we're doing what we're doing. And they make this committee, and on the committee is John Adams and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, the Virginian. And so Adams and Ben Franklin, they both just agree that they're just going to let Thomas Jefferson write this whole thing, and then they'll come back and help him edit it later. But Jefferson is seen as a brilliant writer, which is still an understatement. He's so good. Is seen as a brilliant writer, and they trust that he has the grasp of the language and the ideas to come up with an explanation for why they're about to do what they're about to do. So Jefferson goes and he locks himself up basically in his rented room in Philadelphia, and he spends the next couple weeks writing the document that will give birth to the United States. He spends a couple weeks of his time writing day and night this document that has stood the test of time as an example for the rest of the world. What government is for, why we fight, and it's an explanation for why the United States exists. And it was all done in a couple weeks in a really, really hot, sweltering, rented room in Philadelphia by Thomas Jefferson. All right, so here's where the lesson gets a little bit tricky. We got to start talking about some of the ideas that are inside the Declaration. So Jefferson has been tasked with the responsibility of creating a document that explains to the whole world what we're doing and why we're doing it. We're breaking up with Great Britain and creating our own country. Why are we doing that? What is it that we believe are the reasons for that? What has the king done to push us this far? And why do we believe that we are even entitled to do something like this? It's a lot of responsibility to put in a document. So Jefferson is sitting there in his room and he's beginning to write this declaration out, and he's thinking back to some works that he's read in his youth. And he's thinking back to some of the works of an Englishman by the name of John Locke that he had read. So John Locke was an English political philosopher. Now, when people hear philosophy, they start to panic. Relax, it's going to be okay. So philosophy is not that tricky. Philosophy is just like a system of thought or a way of thinking or a series of beliefs that you might happen to have about something, or some standards and rules that you might apply in certain situations. So like my philosophy on education is try to be entertaining, try to be truthful, try to be respectful as much as you can to everybody, and just be honest. Be honest in your interactions. Be honest in the teaching, and people will respond to that. That's a philosophy, right? That's the way I live my life. That's the way I teach. So a political philosophy is a way in which you believe government should act. Basically, what is it you believe the purpose of government is? So John Locke, as a political philosopher, thought a lot about what are governments for? What do governments do? Where do governments get their power from? And so Locke came up with this idea called the social contract. And so the social contract is a little complicated, but if you stick with me, we'll get there. The social contract works like this. All human beings have within themselves power. And this power allows us to live our lives the way we want, basically. We have this God-given right to just live our lives. So what we do is we create governments to protect ourselves from each other, basically. Because, I want to be able to go off and live my life the way I want, but I don't want you to interfere with that. And you want to live your life your way, and you don't want me to interfere with your life. So we have these rights to our lives. And these rights, Locke believes, are life, liberty, and property. And in order to protect those rights, in order to protect our lives, in order to protect our freedoms, in order to protect the things that we want, we create governments. So your right to life is your ability to just walk around without someone killing you, or without someone, causing you grave bodily harm. Your right to liberty is your freedom to move about the world and do what you want, to work the job that you want, to enjoy the leisures that you want, to just be who it is that you want to be. That's your liberty. And then finally, your property are the things that you acquire. So property can be your house, right? But property can also be, in modern day, your cell phone. Your property can be your clothing. Your property can be just anything that you want to collect, or anything that you want to acquire. And so we want these things. We want our lives. We want our freedom, liberty, and we want our property. But we're afraid other people might take them from us. So other people might hurt you or kill you. Other people might stop you from living your life the way you want. Or other people might take your things, or abuse your things, or damage your things. So what we do is all of us get together as people, and we create governments that will protect us from each other. So we create governments. Governments don't just exist. Governments don't grow out of the ground like grass. Governments are created by people. So again, we have power inside of us. And we take that power and we create a government with it. And that government's job is to protect our lives. So, it's the government's job to arrest and prosecute people who take other people's lives or cause them, bodily injury. We create governments to protect our liberty. So, you have the freedom to live your life the way you want. And if somebody tries to interfere with that, government exists. And then our property. We have government to protect our property rights so that, you don't just come on my property one day and plant a garden. And so that I don't, take something that belongs to you and say, oh, well, you weren't using it, it's mine now. I mean, we can't live in a world like that, right? So we create governments to do that. That's what Locke believed, and Jefferson believed it too. So he's going to take these ideas called the social contract, and he's going to roll that into the Declaration. So again, the social contract is we all have this power inside of us, and we together take this power and create a government to protect our rights. And again, our natural rights, these are rights that we are born with, are life, liberty, and property. So in order to protect those rights from each other, we create government. Locke goes on to say not only do we create government because of the social contract, but if a government that is created by the people fails to live up to its job, fails to live up to its responsibility, then it has broken the social contract. And the people, since they're the ones who created the government, they have a right to change the government or overthrow it. And this is a really important idea that Jefferson is going to borrow. So again, let's think about that. Locke says that people have power within themselves, naturally, that we have these rights that are given to us by God, life, liberty, and property, that in order to protect these rights, we create governments so that other people do not abuse you or your rights. But if a government stops doing that, if a government doesn't do the job that it is tasked with, meaning it doesn't prevent people from abusing you or abusing your rights, or that government begins to abuse your rights, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's broken. And if it's broken, Locke would say, you have a right to change it, repair it, or, here's the important part, overthrow that government and create a new one. And this is the idea that Jefferson is going to borrow as his justification, as his reason for why we're declaring independence from Great Britain. And, this was a pretty crazy idea for Locke to have. So Locke lived in the 1600s, and he's writing about the people having rights and the people having the ability to overthrow their government and replace it with another one. He's saying that in the 1600s, living in England. So he's in England, and he's saying this in the 1600s. That's a pretty extreme idea to have back in the day. But these ideas, a good idea is a good idea. It doesn't matter when it comes around, And so even though it's, more than 100 years later, Jefferson's read it, and he thinks, yeah, man, this makes a lot of sense. We create governments to protect ourselves, and the king is the government, and he's not protecting us any longer. The king is abusing our rights. He's not protecting our rights. So we have the right to destroy that government and create a new one that will protect our rights. That's what we're doing. So, any government is supposed to protect you and your rights to life, liberty, and property. But if that government, and it doesn't matter what kind of government it is, in this case of, Great Britain, it's a monarchy. In the case of the monarchy of Great Britain, if it's not protecting your rights anymore, then it's no good. So either try to make change. In that case, it might be, getting membership in Parliament. And if you can't make change, overthrow it and create a new one. And so that's the idea that Jefferson is going to borrow from Locke, is the social contract, the idea that we all have power inside of us, that we create governments to protect our rights. Those rights are life, liberty, and property. And so government's job is to simply protect those rights so that we can live our lives free of each other's interference. And if a government cannot protect your rights anymore, or it abuses your rights, then you have the right, because you created the government, you brought it into the world, you created it, you can change it, or destroy it and create a new one. And that is the idea that Jefferson is going to borrow for the Declaration, is that we are going to destroy this government and create a new one for ourselves that will protect our rights, that will acknowledge that the power comes from the people, and governments serve the people. We don't serve the government. The government serves us. We created it. And so we're going to create a government that will protect our rights to life, liberty, and property. Jefferson spends a couple weeks sitting inside his rented room in Philadelphia writing out the Declaration of Independence, borrowing these ideas from Locke along the way. And when he's about done, Jefferson shares what he's written with Ben Franklin and John Adams. They're part of this committee that's supposed to be writing the document, but of course, Adams and Franklin, they just tell Jefferson to write the whole thing and call him when they're done. So he writes the document and he shares it with them, and they make a couple changes. And really, the most notable change is they change Locke's definition of your natural rights. And so Locke has your rights as life, liberty, and property. And in the Declaration, they change it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's basically the same idea, your life and liberty. That doesn't change. Pursuit of happiness instead of property. It's a little bit more broad to say pursuit of happiness, because your happiness may or may not be property, but whatever it is that you want to do in life or whatever it is you want to acquire to make you happy, those are your natural rights to live your life the way you want. So your life, your freedoms, and your pursuit of happiness. That's basically, what Jefferson is saying. So here's the thing, though, but he does get from Locke, and he says that that governments get their just powers from the consent of the governed. So that means that the people have to consent to being governed by this government. So again, we have this power inside ourselves. We give up that power and create a government. So because we are giving something up to create the government, we have the right to change and overthrow that government if necessary, if we believe our rights are being trampled, because we're the ones who created it. So governments have the right to exist because the people create them, but they only have a right to exist for so long as we allow them. So that's an important idea. Now, we should mention that the most famous line perhaps from the Declaration is that Jefferson says that all men are created equal. And here's where some controversy kind of pops up, because Jefferson was a slave owner. So if Jefferson believes that all men are created equal, how do you square that circle? How do we explain that he owned people, but he believed that all men are created equal? Without turning this into a whole thing, it's complicated, I think is the best answer I can give you here, because naturally you're probably thinking that. It's complicated. You got to remember, these people are a product of their times, and Jefferson did not like slavery. He wished to see it end, but he also knew that it was impractical for it to end immediately. He knew that slavery was wrong, and yet he was addicted to it. People who were slave owners were addicted to the free labor that slavery provided. And so it's complicated, but you've got Jefferson saying, on one hand, in this document, this beautiful line, that all men are created equal, but then back home at his plantation, he owns human beings. And that is a contradiction that we can't deny. But at the same time, you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You acknowledge that it was a different time. You can't look at people from 1776 with 2018 glasses. It doesn't fit. You got to judge people by the time in which they lived. And for the time in which they lived, Jefferson was a very rich plantation owner who was addicted to slave labor, and he didn't like it. And if he could have changed it, he would have, but he financially just couldn't do it. I mean, Jefferson was always on the verge of bankruptcy. There's no way that he could have paid his slaves. It's just not possible. And a lot of people in the South were like that too. So it's complicated. It's not a great answer. He believed that slavery was on the clock basically, but it wasn't for him to end it. That's the thing. So it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction that needs to be mentioned. It is what it is. So on July 2nd, 1776, after they've got the document pretty much proofread and edited, it comes back to the Committee of the Whole, meaning everybody in the Second Continental Congress gets back together and they read over the document and they take a vote. And they take a vote, and the vote goes 12-0. One state, New York, decides not to vote. They don't vote no, but they don't vote yes either. So the vote is 12 yes, 0 no for independence, and 1 abstention, meaning we're not voting either way. Good enough. 12-0. And so with that, on July 2nd, 1776, we become a free and independent nation. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. Did I just say July 2nd, 1776? I thought independence is supposed to be July 4th. Well, that's just one of those things in history that we didn't get right. So independence is voted on and agreed to on July 2nd. It's not until July 4th that the Declaration is read out loud to people by like a town crier, like a guy who holds the document and just reads it out loud for everybody on a street corner. That doesn't happen until July 4th. So it's agreed to on the 2nd, but it's not announced to the world until July 4th. And so that's the date that is on all the documents. So are we celebrating our independence on the right day? What difference does it make? July 2nd, July 4th, it is what it is. But with the Declaration of Independence, we have completely broken free from England. Jefferson says in the Declaration, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So let's break that down. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. So we believe that these truths are facts. We believe that these facts to be self-evident, meaning like obvious. So we think it's an obvious fact that all men are created equal. And in this case, he may not necessarily mean white and black, but man and king. And that they are endowed, meaning given by their Creator, and that be God, that they are given by God certain rights that can't be taken away. That's what inalienable means, rights that can't be taken away. And that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these are rights that we all have naturally, and they're from God, and they can't be taken away by anyone. You have a right to life, you have a right to liberty, you have a right to the pursuit of happiness, and those are just God-given rights. So to secure these rights, meaning to protect them, to make sure that they can be fulfilled, governments are instituted or created by man. So we create governments to protect our rights. And those governments receive their just powers, meaning their ability to act, their legitimacy. Those governments receive their authority from the consent of the governed, meaning the people who are being governed give their power to the government. We have the power, and we create and give it to the government for it to act. How to act? To protect our rights. Jefferson goes on, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. So what he's saying here is that when any form of government, and it doesn't matter if it's a democracy, a republic, a constitutional monarchy, a theocracy, it doesn't matter what it is, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, meaning it no longer protects your rights. The ends of government, meaning its purpose is to protect your rights. So if a government becomes destructive of your rights, that's what he's saying, then it's the right of the people to alter, meaning change that government, or abolish it, destroy it, and create a new. And to institute new government, meaning create a new government. So this is a really, really important explanation as to what we're doing, because this document is read not just by people in Philadelphia, not by people in Boston, not by just all the colonists, but this thing is read, across the ocean in Great Britain, and it's read in France, and it's read all over Europe. And people around the earth are reading this document and looking at the colonies saying, okay, I can see what they're doing. I understand now. Because until this moment, people think that, we're just not wanting to pay our taxes, that we're just a bunch of colonists who are spoiled and we're trying to get out of paying taxes. And what Jefferson is saying is that this has nothing to do with taxes anymore. We're well past that. This is about us having rights as human beings, and the government no longer is protecting those rights. And if we can't change that government, as we tried, then it's our right to create a new one, and that's what we're going to go ahead and do. And so that's how the document starts, with the explanation of what we're doing, and then the declaration goes on to list all the things that the king has done to offend us, all the ways he's abused our rights. And it's not important to go through that long list. If you ever want to check it out, just pull up the document on the internet, and you can read it. A lot of the things that the king is claimed to have done are things that we've gone over in lessons. So you could check that out if you like. But this is really the important part. This is the really, really important part of the Declaration. The idea that he borrows the social contract from Locke, and he's just saying, listen, we create governments to protect ourselves and to protect our rights and to guarantee our rights, and we have rights that you can't take away, no matter who you are. And if a government can't protect those rights anymore, which this one clearly won't, then we're going to create a new one for ourselves. And that's really what the Declaration is about. It's about declaring we made a good faith effort. The king is no longer protecting us as a monarch or as a government should, and we're going to create our own government now. And that's really what this is all about. Well, that'll do it for this lesson, The American Revolution, Part 2. If you found this video helpful, why don't you go ahead and click on the like button, and maybe subscribe too while you're at it. That way you'll be notified every time I push out a new video. If you'd like a copy of my PowerPoints, notes, or any other materials for any of my classes I've ever taught, go ahead and check out my website, www.toddleap.com. For U.S. History with Lee, I'm Todd Lee. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. I'll see you next time.